Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise military strike by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service against the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii Territory on the morning of December 7, 1941. The attack, also known as the Battle of Pearl Harbor, led to the United States' entry into World War II. The Japanese military leadership referred to the attack as the Hawaii Operation and Operation AI, and as Operation Z during its planning. Japan intended the attack as a preventive action to keep the U.S. Pacific Fleet from interfering with military actions they planned in Southeast Asia against overseas territories of the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and the United States. Over the next 7 hours there were coordinated Japanese attacks on the U.S.-held Philippines, Guam and Wake Island, and on the British Empire in Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. The attack commenced at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian Time. The base was attacked by 353 Imperial Japanese aircraft in 2 waves launched from 6 aircraft carriers. All 8 U.S. Navy battleships were damaged, with 4 sunk. All but the were later raised, and 6 were returned to service and went on to fight in the war. The Japanese also sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, an anti-aircraft training ship, and 1 mine layer. 188 U.S. aircraft were destroyed, 2,403 Americans were killed, and 1,178 others were wounded. Important base installations such as the power station, dry dock, shipyard maintenance and fuel and torpedo storage facilities, as well as the submarine piers and headquarters building, were not attacked. Japanese losses were light: 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines lost, and 64 servicemen killed. 1 Japanese sailor, Kazuo Sakamaki, was captured. The surprise attack came as a profound shock to the American people and led directly to the American entry into World War II in both the Pacific and European theaters. The following day, December 8, the United States declared war on Japan, and several days later, on December 11, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. The U.S. responded with a declaration of war against Germany and Italy. Domestic support for non-interventionism, which had been fading since the fall of France in 1940, disappeared. There were numerous historical precedents for unannounced military action by Japan, but the lack of any formal warning, particularly while negotiations were still apparently ongoing, led President Franklin D. Roosevelt to proclaim December 7, 1941 a date which will live in infamy, because the attack happened without a declaration of war and without explicit warning. The attack on Pearl Harbor was later judged in the Tokyo trials to be a war crime. Diplomatic background. War between Japan and the United States had been a possibility that each nation had been aware of since the 1920s, though tensions did not begin to grow seriously until Japan's 1931 invasion of Manchuria. Over the next decade, Japan continued to expand into China, leading to all-out war between those countries in 1937. Japan spent considerable effort trying to isolate China and achieve sufficient resource independence to attain victory on the mainland. The Southern Operation was designed to assist these efforts. From December 1937, events such as the Japanese attack on USS Panay, the Allison incident, and the Nanking massacre swung public opinion in the West sharply against Japan. Fearing Japanese expansion, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France provided loan assistance for war supply contracts to China. In 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina in an effort to control supplies reaching China. The United States halted shipments of airplanes, parts, machine tools and aviation gasoline to Japan, which was perceived by Japan as an unfriendly act. The U.S. did not stop oil exports to Japan at that time, in part because prevailing sentiment in Washington was that such an action would be an extreme step that Japan would likely consider a provocation, given Japanese dependence on U.S. oil. Early in 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt moved the Pacific Fleet to Hawaii from its previous base in San Diego, and ordered a military build-up in the Philippines in the hope of discouraging Japanese aggression in the Far East, because the Japanese High Command was certain that any attack on the UK's Southeast Asian colonies, including Singapore, would bring the US into war. A devastating preventive strike appeared to be the only way to avoid US naval interference. An invasion of the Philippines was also considered necessary by Japanese war planners. The U.S. War Plan Orange had envisioned defending the Philippines with a 40,000-man elite force. This was opposed by Douglas MacArthur, who felt that he would need a force 10 times that size, and was never implemented. By 1941, U.S. planners anticipated abandonment of the Philippines at the outbreak of war, and orders to that effect were given in late 1941 to Admiral Thomas Hart, commander of the Asiatic Fleet. The U.S. ceased oil exports to Japan in July 1941, following Japanese expansion into French Indochina after the fall of France, in part because of new American restrictions on domestic oil consumption. This in turn caused the Japanese to proceed with plans to take the Dutch East Indies, an oil-rich territory. On August 17, Roosevelt warned Japan that the U.S. was prepared to take steps against Japan if it attacked neighboring countries. The Japanese were faced with the option of either withdrawing from China and losing face, or seizing and securing new sources of raw materials in the resource-rich European-controlled colonies of Southeast Asia. Japan and the U.S. engaged in negotiations during the course of 1941 in an effort to improve relations. During these negotiations, Japan offered to withdraw from most of China and Indochina when peace was made, with the nationalist government adopting an independent interpretation of the Tripartite Pact and not to discriminate in trade provided all other countries reciprocated. Washington rejected these proposals. Japanese Prime Minister Konoe then offered to meet with Roosevelt, but Roosevelt insisted on coming to an agreement before any meeting. The U.S. ambassador to Japan repeatedly urged Roosevelt to accept the meeting, warning that it was the only way to preserve the conciliatory Konoe government and peace in the Pacific. His recommendation was not acted upon. The Konoe government collapsed the following month when the Japanese military refused to agree to the withdrawal of all troops from China. Japan's final proposal on November 20 offered to withdraw their forces from southern Indochina and not to launch any attacks in Southeast Asia, provided that the US, the UK, and the Netherlands ceased aiding China and lifted their sanctions against Japan. The American counterproposal of November 26 required Japan to evacuate all of China without conditions and conclude non-aggression pacts with Pacific powers. However, the day before the hull note was delivered on November 26 in Japan, the main Japanese attack fleet left port for Pearl Harbor. Military planning. Preliminary planning for an attack on Pearl Harbor to protect the move into the southern resource area had begun very early in 1941 under the auspices of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, then commanding Japan's combined fleet. He won assent to formal planning and training for an attack from the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff only after much contention with naval headquarters. including a threat to resign his command. Full-scale planning was underway by early spring 1941, primarily by Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka with assistance from Captain Minoru Genda and Yamamoto's Deputy Chief of Staff Captain Kamito Kuroshima. The planners studied the 1940 British air attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto intensively. Over the next several months, pilots were trained, equipment was adapted, and intelligence was collected. Despite these preparations, Emperor Hirohito did not approve the attack plan until November 5, after the third of four imperial conferences called to consider the matter. Final authorization was not given by the emperor until December 1, after a majority of Japanese leaders advised him the hull note would destroy the fruits of the China incident, endanger Manchukuo, and undermine Japanese control of Korea. By late 1941, many observers believed that hostilities between the US and Japan were imminent. A Gallup poll just before the attack on Pearl Harbor found that 52% of Americans expected war with Japan, 27% did not, and 21% had no opinion. While U.S. Pacific bases and facilities had been placed on alert on many occasions, U.S. officials doubted Pearl Harbor would be the first target. Instead, they expected the Philippines would be attacked first. This presumption was due to the threat that the air bases throughout the country and the naval base at Manila posed to sea lanes as well as to the shipment of supplies to Japan from territory to the south. They also incorrectly believed that Japan was not capable of mounting more than one major naval operation at a time. Objectives. The Japanese attack had several major aims. First, it intended to destroy important American fleet units, thereby preventing the Pacific Fleet from interfering with Japanese conquest of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, and to enable Japan to conquer Southeast Asia without interference. Second, it was hoped to buy time for Japan to consolidate its position and increase its naval strength before shipbuilding authorized by the 1940 Vince and Walsh Act erased any chance of victory. Third, to deliver a blow to America's ability to mobilize its forces in the Pacific. Battleships were chosen as the main targets since they were the prestige ships of any navy at the time. Finally, it was hoped that the attack would undermine American morale such that the U.S. government would drop its demands contrary to Japanese interests and would seek a compromise peace with Japan. Striking the Pacific Fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor carried two distinct disadvantages. The targeted ships would be in very shallow water, so it would be relatively easy to salvage and possibly repair them, and most of the crews would survive the attack since many would be on shore leave or would be rescued from the harbor. A further important disadvantage, this of timing unknown to the Japanese, was the absence from Pearl Harbor of all three of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers. IJN top command was so imbued with Admiral Mahan's decisive battle doctrine, especially that of destroying the maximum number of battleships, that, despite these concerns, Yamamoto decided to press ahead. Japanese confidence in their ability to achieve a short victorious war also meant other targets in the harbor, especially the Navy Yard, oil tank farms and submarine base, were ignored since, by their thinking, the war would be over before the influence of these facilities would be felt. Approach and attack. On November 26, 1941, a Japanese task force of 6 aircraft carriers and departed northern Japan en route to a position northwest of Hawaii, intending to launch its 408 aircraft to attack Pearl Harbor, 360 for the 2 attack waves, and 48 on defensive combat air patrol, including 9 fighters from the first wave. The first wave was to be the primary attack, while the second wave was to attack carriers as its first objective and cruisers as its second, with battleships as the third target. The first wave carried most of the weapons to attack capital ships, mainly specially adapted Type 91 aerial torpedoes, which were designed with an anti-roll mechanism and a rudder extension that let them operate in shallow water. The aircrews were ordered to select the highest value targets, or if these were not present, any other high-value ships. First wave dive bombers were to attack ground targets. Fighters were ordered to strafe and destroy as many parked aircraft as possible to ensure they did not get into the air to intercept the bombers, especially in the first wave. When the fighters' fuel got low, they were to refuel at the aircraft carriers and return to combat. Fighters were to serve cap duties when needed, especially over U.S. airfields. Before the attack commenced, 2 reconnaissance aircraft launched from cruisers and were sent to scout over Oahu and Maui and report on U.S. fleet composition and location. Reconnaissance aircraft flights risked alerting the U.S. and were not necessary. U.S. fleet composition and preparedness information in Pearl Harbor was already known due to the reports of the Japanese spy Takeo Yoshikawa. A report of the absence of the U.S. fleet in Lahaina anchorage off Maui was received from the fleet submarine. Another 4 scout planes patrolled the area between the Japanese carrier force and Niihau to detect any counterattack. Submarines. Fleet submarines in each embarked a Type A midget submarine for transport to the waters off Oahu. The 5 I-boats left Kure Naval District on November 25, 1941. On December 6, they came to within 10 nmi of the mouth of Pearl Harbor, and launched their midget subs at about 1 o'clock on December 7. At 3:42 Hawaiian Time, the minesweeper spotted a midget submarine periscope southwest of the Pearl Harbor entrance buoy, and alerted the destroyer. The midget may have entered Pearl Harbor. However, Ward sank another midget submarine at 6:37 in the first American shots in the Pacific Theater. A midget submarine on the north side of Ford Island missed the seaplane tender with her first torpedo and missed the attacking destroyer with her other one before being sunk by Monaghan at 8:43. A third midget submarine, Ha-19, grounded twice, once outside the harbor entrance and again on the east side of Oahu, where it was captured on December 8. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki swam ashore and was captured by Hawaii National Guard Corporal David Akui, becoming the first Japanese prisoner of war. A fourth had been damaged by a depth charge attack and was abandoned by its crew before it could fire its torpedoes. Japanese forces received a radio message from a midget submarine at 0:41 on December 8 claiming damage to 1 or more large warships inside Pearl Harbor. In 1992, 2000 and 2001, Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory's submersibles found the wreck of the 5th midget submarine, lying in 3 parts outside Pearl Harbor. The wreck was in the debris field, where much surplus U.S. equipment was dumped after the war, including vehicles and landing craft. Both of its torpedoes were missing. This correlates with reports of 2 torpedoes fired at the light cruiser at 10:04 at the entrance of Pearl Harbor and a possible torpedo fired at destroyer at 8:21. Japanese declaration of war. The attack took place before any formal declaration of war was made by Japan. But this was not Admiral Yamamoto's intention. He originally stipulated that the attack should not commence until 30 minutes after Japan had informed the United States that peace negotiations were at an end. However, the attack began before the notice could be delivered. Tokyo transmitted the 5,000-word notification in 2 blocks to the Japanese embassy in Washington. Transcribing the message took too long for the Japanese ambassador to deliver it on schedule. In the event, it was not presented until more than an hour after the attack began. The final part is sometimes described as a declaration of war, while it was viewed, by a number of senior U.S. government and military officials, as a very strong indicator negotiations were likely to be terminated, and that war might break out at any moment. It neither declared war nor severed diplomatic relations. A declaration of war was printed on the front page of Japan's newspapers in the evening edition of December 8, but not delivered to the U.S. government until the day after the attack. For decades, conventional wisdom held that Japan attacked without first formally breaking diplomatic relations, only because of accidents and bumbling that delayed the delivery of a document hinting at war to Washington. In 1999, however, Takeo Iguchi, a professor of law and international relations at International Christian University in Tokyo, discovered documents that pointed to a vigorous debate inside the government over how, and indeed whether, to notify Washington of Japan's intention to break off negotiations and start a war, including a December 7 entry in the war diary saying, "Oh, your deceptive diplomacy is steadily proceeding towards success." Of this, Iguchi said, "The diary shows that the Army and Navy did not want to give any proper declaration of war, or indeed prior notice even of the termination of negotiations, and they clearly prevailed. In any event, even if the Japanese had decoded and delivered the 14-part message before the beginning of the attack, it would not have constituted either a formal break of diplomatic relations or a declaration of war." The final 2 paragraphs of the message read, "Thus the earnest hope of the Japanese government to adjust Japanese-American relations and to preserve and promote the peace of the Pacific through cooperation with the American government has finally been lost. The Japanese government regrets to have to notify hereby the American government that in view of the attitude of the American government it cannot but consider that it is impossible to reach an agreement through further negotiations." First wave composition. The first attack wave of 183 planes was launched north of Oahu, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. 6 planes failed to launch due to technical difficulties. It included, as the first wave approached Oahu, it was detected by the U.S. Army 270 Seychelles Rupees radar at Opana Point near the island's northern tip. This post had been in training mode for months, but was not yet operational. The operators, Privates George Elliott, Jr. and Joseph Lockhart, reported a target, but Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler, a newly assigned officer at the thinly manned Intercept Center, presumed it was the scheduled arrival of 6 B-17 bombers from California. The Japanese planes were approaching from a direction very close to the bombers, and while the operators had never seen a formation as large on radar, they neglected to tell Tyler of its size. Taylor, for security reasons, could not tell the operators of the 6 B-17s that were due. As the first wave planes approached Oahu, they encountered and shot down several U.S. aircraft. At least one of these radioed a somewhat incoherent warning. Other warnings, from ships off the harbor entrance, were still being processed or awaiting confirmation when the attacking planes began bombing and strafing. Nevertheless, it is not clear any warnings would have had much effect even if they had been interpreted correctly and much more promptly. The results the Japanese achieved in the Philippines were essentially the same as at Pearl Harbor, though MacArthur had almost 9 hours warning that the Japanese had already attacked Pearl Harbor. The air portion of the attack began at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time with the attack on Kaneohe. A total of 353 Japanese planes in 2 waves reached Oahu. Slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers led the first wave, exploiting the first moments of surprise to attack the most important ships present, while dive bombers attacked U.S. air bases across Oahu, starting with Hickam Field, the largest, and Wheeler Field, the main U.S. Army Air Force's fighter base. The 171 planes in the second wave attacked the Army Air Force's Bellows Field near Kaneohe on the windward side of the island and Ford Island. The only aerial opposition came from a handful of P-36 Hawks, P-40 Warhawks, and some SPD Dauntless dive bombers from the carrier. In the first wave attack, about 8 of the 49 800 kg armor-piercing bombs dropped hit their intended battleship targets. At least 2 of those bombs broke up on impact. Another detonated before penetrating an unarmored deck, and 1 was a dud. 13 of the 40 torpedoes hit battleships and 4 torpedoes hit other ships. Men aboard U.S. ships awoke to the sounds of alarms, bombs exploding, and gunfire, prompting bleary-eyed men to dress as they ran to general quarters stations. The defenders were very unprepared. Ammunition lockers were locked aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip in the open to prevent sabotage, guns unmanned. Despite this low alert status, many American military personnel responded effectively during the attack. Ensign Joe Taussig Jr. aboard commanded the ship's anti-aircraft guns and was severely wounded but continued to be on post. Lieutenant Commander F.J. Thomas commanded Nevada in the captain's absence, and got her underway until the ship was grounded at 9:10 a.m. One of the destroyers got underway with only 4 officers aboard, all ensigns, none with more than a year's sea duty. She operated at sea for 36 hours before her commanding officer managed to get back aboard. Captain Mervyn Benyon, commanding, led his men until he was cut down by fragments from a bomb which hit moored alongside. Second wave composition. The second planned wave consisted of 171 planes, 54 B-5Ns, 81 D-3As, and 36 A-6Ms, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki. 4 planes failed to launch because of technical difficulties. This wave, and its targets comprised the second wave, was divided into 3 groups. 1 was tasked to attack Kaneohe, the rest Pearl Harbor proper. The separate sections arrived at the attack point almost simultaneously from several directions. American casualties and damage. 90 minutes after it began, the attack was over. 2,008 sailors were killed, and 710 others wounded. 218 soldiers and airmen were killed and 364 wounded. 109 Marines were killed and 69 wounded, and 68 civilians were killed and 35 wounded. In total, 2,403 Americans died and 1,178 were wounded. 18 ships were sunk or run aground, including 5 battleships. All of the Americans killed or wounded during the attack were non-combatants, given the fact there was no state of war when the attack occurred. Of the American fatalities, nearly half were due to the explosion of S forward magazine after it was hit by a modified 16-inch shell. Already damaged by a torpedo and on fire amidships, Nevada attempted to exit the harbor. She was targeted by many Japanese bombers as she got underway and sustained more hits from 250-pound bombs which started further fires. She was deliberately beached to avoid blocking the harbor entrance, was hit by 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes. The crew might have kept her afloat but were ordered to abandon ship just as they were raising power for the pumps, burning oil from Arizona. and drifted down on her and probably made the situation look worse than it was. The disarmed target ship was holed twice by torpedoes. West Virginia was hit by 7 torpedoes. The seventh, tearing away her rudder, was hit by 4 torpedoes, the last 2 above her belt armor, which caused her to capsize, was hit by 2 of the converted 16 shells, but neither caused serious damage. Although the Japanese concentrated on battleships, they did not ignore other targets. The light cruiser was torpedoed and a concussion from the blast capsized the neighboring Malaya. 2 destroyers in dry dock, and were destroyed when bombs penetrated their fuel bunkers. The leaking fuel caught fire. Flooding the dry dock in an effort to fight fire made the burning oil rise, and both were burned out. Cassin slipped from her keel blocks and rolled against Downs. The light cruiser was holed by a torpedo. The light cruiser was damaged but remained in service. The repair vessel moored alongside Arizona was heavily damaged and beached. The seaplane tender Curtis was also damaged. The destroyer was badly damaged when 2 bombs penetrated her forward magazine. Of the 402 American aircraft in Hawaii, 188 were destroyed and 159 damaged, 155 of them on the ground. Almost none were actually ready to take off to defend the base. 8 Army Air Forces pilots managed to get airborne during the attack, and 6 were credited with downing at least 1 Japanese aircraft during the attack. First Lieutenant Louis M. Sanders, Second Lieutenant Philip M. Rasmussen, Second Lieutenant Kenneth M. Taylor, Second Lieutenant George S. Welch, Second Lieutenant Harry W. Brown, and Second Lieutenant Gordon H. Sterling, Jr. Sterling was shot down by Lieutenant Fujita over Kaneohe Bay and is listed as body not recovered. Lieutenant John L. Daines was killed by friendly fire returning from a victory over Kawa. Of 33 PBYs in Hawaii, 24 were destroyed and 6 others damaged beyond repair. Friendly fire brought down some U.S. planes on top of that, including 5 from an inbound flight. From Japanese attacks on barracks killed additional personnel. At the time of the attack, 9 civilian aircraft were flying in the vicinity of Pearl Harbor. Of these, 3 were shot down. Japanese losses: 55 Japanese airmen and 9 submariners were killed in the attack and 1 was captured. Of Japan's 414 available planes, 29 were lost during the battle, with another 74 damaged by anti-aircraft fire from the ground. Possible third wave: several Japanese junior officers including Fuchida and Genda urged Nagumo to carry out a third strike in order to destroy as much of Pearl Harbor's fuel and torpedo storage, maintenance, and dry dock facilities as possible. Genda, who had unsuccessfully advocated for invading Hawaii after the air attack, believed that without an invasion 3 strikes were necessary to disable the base as much as possible. The captains of the other 5 carriers in the task force reported they were willing and ready to carry out a third strike. Military historians have suggested the destruction of these shore facilities would have hampered the U.S. Pacific Fleet far more seriously than the loss of its battleships. If they had been wiped out, serious American operations in the Pacific would have been postponed for more than a year, according to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, later Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. It would have prolonged the war another 2 years. Nagumo, however, decided to withdraw, for several reasons, at a conference aboard Yamato the following morning. Yamamoto initially supported Nagumo, in retrospect sparing the vital dockyards, maintenance shops, and oil depots meant the U.S. could respond relatively quickly to Japanese activities in the Pacific. Yamamoto later regretted Nagumo's decision to withdraw. and categorically stated it had been a great mistake not to order a third strike. Ships lost or damaged. 17 ships were damaged or lost in the attack, of which 14 were repaired and returned to service. Salvage. After a systematic search for survivors, formal salvage operations began. Captain Homer N. Wallin, material officer for Commander Battle Force U.S. Pacific Fleet, was immediately ordered to lead salvage operations. Within a short time I was relieved of all other duties and ordered to full-time work as Fleet Salvage Officer. Around Pearl Harbor, divers from the Navy, the Naval Shipyard and civilian contractors began work on the ships that could be refloated. They patched holes, cleared debris and pumped water out of ships. Navy divers worked inside the damaged ships. Within 6 months 5 battleships and 2 cruisers were patched or refloated so they could be sent to shipyards in Pearl Harbor and on the mainland for extensive repair. Intensive salvage operations continued for another year. A total of some 20,000 man-hours underwater. Oklahoma, while successfully raised, was never repaired and capsized while under tow to the mainland in 1947. Arizona and the target ship Utah were too heavily damaged for salvage, though much of their armament and equipment was removed and put to use aboard other vessels. Today the 2 hulks remain where they were sunk, with Arizona becoming a war memorial. Aftermath. In the wake of the attack, 15 Medals of Honor, 51 Navy Crosses, 53 Silver Stars, 4 Navy and Marine Corps medals, 1 Distinguished Flying Cross, 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 1 Distinguished Service Medal and 3 Bronze Star medals were awarded to the American servicemen who distinguished themselves in combat at Pearl Harbor. Additionally, a special military award, the Pearl Harbor Commemorative Medal, was later authorized for all military veterans of the attack. The day after the attack, Roosevelt delivered his famous infamy speech to a joint session of Congress calling for a formal declaration of war on the Empire of Japan. Congress obliged his request less than an hour later. On December 11, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Even though the Tripartite Pact did not require it, Congress issued a declaration of war against Germany and Italy later that same day. The UK actually declared war on Japan 9 hours before the US did, partially due to Japanese attacks on Malaya, Singapore and Hong Kong, and partially due to Winston Churchill's promise to declare war within the hour of a Japanese attack on the United States. The attack was an initial shock to all the Allies in the Pacific Theater. Further losses compounded the alarming setback. Japan attacked the Philippines hours later. Only 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk off the coast of Malaya, causing British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later to recollect, "In all the war one never received a more direct shock. As I turned and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank in upon me. There were no British or American capital ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific except the American survivors of Pearl Harbor who were hastening back to California. Over this vast expanse of waters Japan was supreme and we everywhere were weak and naked." Throughout the war, Pearl Harbor was frequently used in American propaganda. One further consequence of the attack on Pearl Harbor and its aftermath was that Japanese American residents and citizens were relocated to nearby Japanese American internment camps. Within hours of the attack, hundreds of Japanese American leaders were rounded up and brought to high-security camps such as Sand Island at the mouth of Honolulu Harbor and Kilauea Military Camp on the island of Hawaii. Eventually more than 110,000 Japanese Americans Nearly all who lived on the west coast were forced into interior camps, but in Hawaii, where the 150,000-plus Japanese Americans composed over one-third of the population, only 1,200 to 1,800 were interned. The attack also had international consequences. The Canadian province of British Columbia, bordering the Pacific Ocean, had long had a large population of Japanese immigrants and their Japanese-Canadian descendants. Pre-war tensions were exacerbated by the Pearl Harbor attack, leading to a reaction from the Government of Canada. On February 24, 1942, Ordering Council PC No. 1486 was passed under the War Measures Act, allowing for the forced removal of any and all Canadians of Japanese descent from British Columbia, as well as the prohibiting from them returning to the province. On 4 March, regulations under the Act were adopted to evacuate Japanese Canadians. As a result, 12,000 were interned in interior camps, 2,000 were sent to road camps, and another 2,000 were forced to work in the prairies at sugar beet farms. Niihau incident. The Japanese planners had determined that some means was required for rescuing flyers whose aircraft were too badly damaged to return to the carriers. The island of Niihau, only 30 minutes flying time from Pearl Harbor, was designated as the rescue point. The Zero, flown by Petty Officer Shigenori Nishikaichi of Hiryu, was damaged in the attack on Wheeler, so he flew to the rescue point on Niihau. The aircraft was further damaged on landing. Nishikaichi was helped from the wreckage by one of the native Hawaiians who, aware of the tension between the United States and Japan, took the pilot's maps and other documents. The island's residents had no telephones or radio, and were completely unaware of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Nishikaichi enlisted the support of 3 Japanese American residents in an attempt to recover the documents. During the ensuing struggles, Nishikaichi was killed, and a Hawaiian civilian was wounded. One collaborator committed suicide, and his wife and the third collaborator were sent to prison. These, with which the local ethnic Japanese residents had apparently gone to the assistance of Nishikaichi, was a source of concern for many and tended to support those who believed that local Japanese could not be trusted. Strategic implications. Admiral Hara Tadaichi summed up the Japanese result by saying, "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war." To a similar effect, see Isoroku Yamamoto's alleged sleeping giant quote. While the attack accomplished its intended objective, it turned out to be largely unnecessary. Unbeknownst to Yamamoto, who conceived the original plan, the U.S. Navy had decided as far back as 1935 to abandon charging across the Pacific towards the Philippines in response to an outbreak of war. The U.S. instead adopted Plan Dog in 1940, which emphasized keeping the IJN out of the eastern Pacific and away from the shipping lanes to Australia, while the U.S. concentrated on defeating Nazi Germany. Fortunately for the United States, the American aircraft carriers were untouched by the Japanese attack. Otherwise, the Pacific Fleet's ability to conduct offensive operations would have been crippled for a year or more, as it was the elimination of the battleships left the U.S. Navy with no choice but to rely on its aircraft carriers and submarines, the very weapons with which the U.S. Navy halted and eventually reversed the Japanese advance. While 6 of the 8 battleships were repaired and returned to service, their relatively low speed and high fuel consumption limited their deployment, and they served mainly in shore bombardment roles. A major flaw of Japanese strategic thinking was a belief that the ultimate Pacific battle would be fought by battleships, in keeping with the doctrine of Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan. As a result, Yamamoto hoarded battleships for a decisive battle that never happened. The Japanese confidence in their ability to achieve a short, victorious war meant that they neglected Pearl Harbor's Navy repair yards, oil tank farms, submarine base and old headquarters building. All of these targets were omitted from Genda's list. Yet they proved more important than any battleship to the American war efforts in the Pacific. The survival of the repair shops and fuel depots allowed Pearl Harbor to maintain logistical support to the U.S. Navy's operations such as the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. It was submarines that immobilized the Imperial Japanese Navy's heavy ships, and brought Japan's economy to a virtual standstill by crippling the transportation of oil and raw materials. By the end of 1942, import of raw materials was cut to half of what it had been, to a disastrous 10 million tons, while oil import was almost completely stopped. Lastly, the basement of the old administration building was the home of the cryptanalytic unit, which contributed significantly to the Midway ambush and the submarine force's success. Retrospective debate on American intelligence. Ever since the Japanese attack, there has been debate as to how and why the United States had been caught unaware, and how much and when American officials knew of Japanese plans and related topics. Military officers, including Gen. Billy Mitchell, had pointed out the vulnerability of Pearl to air attack. At least two naval wargames, one in 1932 and another in 1936, proved that Pearl was vulnerable to such an attack. Admiral James Richardson was removed from command shortly after protesting President Roosevelt's decision to move the bulk of the Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor. The decisions of military and political leadership to ignore these warnings has contributed to conspiracy theories. Several writers, including journalist Robert Stinnett and former United States Rear Admiral Robert Alfred Theobald, have argued that various parties high in the U.S. and British governments knew of the attack in advance and may even have let it happen, or encouraged it in order to force the U.S. into war via the so-called backdoor. However, this conspiracy theory is rejected by mainstream historians. Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Would you like to know more?